they saved a nation that wouldn't save them, the paradox of black heroes. A story of sacrifice, faith, and the cost of fighting for a freedom you cannot claim. The promise and the lie. The church bells of Mount Calvary Baptist in Nashville, Tennessee rang out across the city on a Sunday morning in March 1942, their sound carrying a desperate, hopeful prayer into the spring air. Inside, the pews were packed with black families, mothers clutching prayer books, fathers in their Sunday best, children fidgeting in the heat generated by 200 bodies in a space meant for 150. Reverend Thomas Hutchins stood at the pulpit, his silver-haired head bowed, his weathered hands gripping the wooden edges with the kind of grip that comes from decades of preaching truth to people who needed to hear it. The President himself has called, Reverend Hutchins proclaimed, his voice rich and resonant, for the sons of this nation to stand up and defend liberty against the forces of tyranny. And I say to you, he paused, looking out over his congregation, a young man will answer that call. Because we are Americans. Because we believe in the promise of this nation. At the back of the church, 23-year-old Lieutenant Marcus Washington sat in uniform, about to deploy to a war he believed, or wanted to believe, was about to change everything. His mother, Eleanor, sat beside him, her hand gripping his so tightly he could feel her pulse in her fingertips. His sister, Ruth, sat on his other side, tears already streaming down her face though he hadn't even left yet. Marcus had been born in a sharecropper's cabin in Mississippi, the son of a man who had worked the same land all his life for a white farmer who treated him with barely concealed contempt. His father, Samuel, had died in 1938 when Marcus was 19, from an infected wound that should have been treatable if a colored hospital had existed in their county. His death had been the catalyst for everything that followed: Marcus's enrollment at Fisk University, his decision to join the ROTC program, his commission as an officer despite the Army's reluctance to commission black men. Now, sitting in that church, Marcus believed something that history would prove was naive but was, at that moment, genuine, that if black men fought for America, if they shed their blood on distant battlefields, something would change. That the nation would recognize their sacrifice and be compelled to grant them full citizenship, full humanity, full rights. It was a beautiful lie. And like all beautiful lies, it carried within it the seeds of profound tragedy. Reverend Hutchins finished his sermon with a passage that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, words from the Gospel of John that his grandmother had taught him as a child: "Greater loveth no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15 verse 13. But as Marcus would come to understand, there was a question beneath that verse that no one spoke aloud in 1942. What happens when you lay down your life for people who refuse to acknowledge you as a friend? The training began at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, where the U.S. Army was hastily assembling the 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black unit composed of officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men pulled from across the nation. They were doctors, lawyers, teachers, farmers, and factory workers who had volunteered or been drafted, all of them believing they were part of something greater than themselves. Marcus was assigned as a company commander, responsible for 48 men. Among them was Corporal Dave Turner, a former teacher from Philadelphia with a sharp intellect and an even sharper sense of irony. There was Sergeant James Jim Patterson, a three-time divorced man from Chicago who treated the Army as an escape route and the men under his command as the only family he had left. And there was Private William Bill Jackson, just 19 years old, from rural Georgia, so young and eager to prove himself that it broke Marcus's heart to see it. The white officers who oversaw their training made no secret of their skepticism. Black men couldn't lead. Black men didn't have the intellectual capacity to understand modern warfare. Black men were naturally cowardly and would flee at the first sign of actual combat. These beliefs, rooted in centuries of racist pseudoscience and perpetuated by military tradition, infected the training like a virus. But Marcus and his men proved them wrong every single day. They were sharp. They were dedicated. They understood that they were being watched, that every mistake would be used as ammunition to prove the racist ideology underlying the entire enterprise. One night, sitting in the barracks after a particularly grueling training exercise, Dave Turner spoke words that would echo through the war and beyond. "Sir, do you ever wonder," Dave asked quietly, "if we're not just training to fight Germany, but training to fight ourselves? Like, we're learning to be soldiers so we can prove we are human, when the fact that we have to prove that it all already proves how inhuman this country thinks we are? Marcus didn't have an answer. He had his own doubts, his own late-night fears, his own wrestling with the contradiction between his faith and his circumstances. But he couldn't let those doubts show. The men looked to him for certainty, for the conviction that what they were doing mattered, that the sacrifice would mean something. "We do this," Marcus finally said, "because it's the right thing. Because our people deserve better, and the only way to make them see that is to show them we're worth it." It sounded good. But underneath, Marcus felt the hollowness of the argument, the way it shifted responsibility, placed the burden on the oppressed to prove their own humanity rather than demanding the oppressor acknowledge it. If you're gripped by this story of black soldiers fighting for a nation that refused to fight for them, subscribe to our channel to hear more untold stories of courage, contradiction, and faith in the face of impossible odds. These are the narratives that textbooks ignore. Help us keep them alive. The 92nd Infantry Division shipped out to North Africa in the summer of 1943, and from there to Italy in late 1943. By early 1944, Marcus and his men were engaged in combat against German forces in some of the most brutal terrain in Europe: the mountains, the narrow valleys, the constant exposure to artillery and machine gun fire. The combat itself was terrifying and glorious in equal measure. In one engagement near Massa, Italy, Marcus led his company through a withering crossfire to take and hold a strategic ridge. 3 men died. 12 were wounded. But they held the position, and the German forces retreated. For that action, Marcus was recommended for the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against the enemy." But the Silver Star never came. The recommendation was denied by higher command, without explanation. Marcus would later learn that it was because a black officer receiving such a high honor would have morale implications for the white troops. Better to let the heroism go unrecognized than to create the impression that black soldiers were the equal of white soldiers. This rejection, small in the grand scheme of the war, but enormous in its implications, broke something in Marcus. Not his resolve to fight. His men depended on him, and he would never let them down. But his belief that sacrifice would be rewarded, that recognition would follow heroism, that the nation's conscience would be moved by blood spilled in its defense, that belief shattered like glass. Dave Turner noticed the change immediately. "You're different, sir," Dave said one evening as they sat in a tent, the sounds of artillery in the distance providing an irregular percussion to their conversation. "You carry yourself differently now." The recommendation was denied, Marcus said quietly. He hadn't planned to tell anyone, but the words seemed to pour out of him like blood from a wound. The Silver Star. They said it would affect morale if a colored officer got too much recognition. Dave was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that seemed to contain all the despair of the moment. "Of course they did. Because we are only supposed to be heroes when it doesn't make white people uncomfortable. We are supposed to die nobly but live invisibly." The war continued, and the men of the 92nd continued to fight with ferocity and dedication. They pushed through the Italian countryside, suffered through the winter, endured diseases, wounds, and the constant fear that tomorrow might be the day they didn't make it. They liberated Italian villages from Nazi occupation. They helped push German forces northward. And all the while, they dealt with racism from their own side that sometimes seemed as dangerous as the enemy. There were instances when supplies meant for the black troops were diverted to white units. There were times when white officers deliberately put them in the most dangerous positions, as if testing whether they would break under pressure. There were moments when they would be accused of cowardice for tactical decisions that white officers were praised for making. Young Bill Jackson was killed in April 1944, not by enemy fire but by a booby trap left in an abandoned German position. The white officer in charge of the sweep that triggered it blamed it on typical colored carelessness, never acknowledging the bravery Bill had shown in alerting others to the danger even as it was killing him. Jim Patterson wept when they recovered Bill's body. Marcus held him, this tough Chicago man who had said the army was his only family, and felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him like a physical thing. These men, his men, were dying not just for their country, but for an idea of what their country might become. And the country was rejecting them even as they died. By 1945, as the war in Europe was winding down, Marcus had come to understand something that no one in 1942 could have predicted: the greatest enemy facing the 92nd Infantry Division was not Nazi Germany. It was the United States of America. Germany was an external enemy, clearly defined, with clear objectives. But America was an internal enemy, attacking from within, using the very nation's laws and customs as weapons. Germany wanted to conquer them. America wanted to convince them they didn't deserve to be conquered because they didn't deserve to be anything at all. One of the last letters Marcus received from home came from his mother, Eleanor. She wrote about the lynching of a black man in Tennessee, about the continued segregation despite the war, about how some of the white citizens in their town had said that the real threat to America wasn't Germany, it was the uppity Negroes coming back from the war thinking they were equal to white people. Marcus read that letter in a tent on the Italian countryside, with the sounds of war still echoing in his ears, and felt something inside him crystallize into a hard, bitter diamond of understanding. He had fought not for the nation he lived in, but for the nation he wished existed. And that nation, the one that would recognize his humanity, that would grant his people full citizenship, that would say, "Thank you," instead of, "Sit at the back of the bus," that nation was still a dream, not a reality. If this story of sacrifice turned to betrayal, of heroes rejected by the nations they saved, is moving your soul, please like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten narratives into the light. Marcus returned to the United States in October 1945, 15 days after the official end of the war in the Pacific. He was in uniform, decorated with medals for his service, his bars still on his shoulders marking him as a commissioned officer. He also carried within him a wound far deeper than any physical injury, the wound of realized betrayal. He arrived in Nashville on a Tuesday morning, taking a local bus from the train station to his neighborhood. The bus driver took one look at his uniform and said, "Colored section in the back, sir." The word, "sir," was said without respect. It was a mockery, a refusal to acknowledge what the uniform represented. Marcus moved to the back without protest. Protest would only endanger him, but inside, something screamed. He had just spent 3 years fighting across 2 continents. He had seen men die in his arms. He had held the line when German artillery was falling around him. And in his own country, he couldn't sit in the front of a bus. Dave Turner was waiting for him at his mother's house. They embraced without words, 2 men who had shared horrors that no one else could understand. Dave had taken a job at Howard University, working as a professor while he finished his law degree. He had also become involved with the nascent civil rights movement, connecting with other returning veterans who were beginning to understand that the fight wasn't over, it had just taken a different form. "I've been working with some veteran organizations," Dave explained as they sat on Eleanor's porch, watching the sun set over Nashville. "We're coordinating with the NAACP, pushing for legislative change, demanding recognition for what we did. There's momentum building, Marcus. Real momentum." Marcus wanted to believe him. But the bitterness had taken root too deeply. "They gave us guns and told us to defend freedom," Marcus said quietly. "But the freedom we defended was only ever meant for some people. We weren't defending freedom. We were defending a lie, and the lie is about to get a lot harder to maintain because we saw what actual liberty looks like across the Atlantic." Dave didn't argue. He couldn't. The facts were there for anyone with eyes to see. Over the following weeks, Marcus struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The Veterans Administration had promised housing assistance for all returning servicemen, but the assistance seemed strangely unavailable for black veterans. Jobs were scarce. Respect was scarcer still. He watched white veterans, no more skilled or experienced than he was, walk into positions of authority and opportunity while he was relegated to positions of service. His mother, Eleanor, saw the change in him and it broke her heart. "Your father would be proud," she said to him one night, as they sat in the living room. "He would see what you've done and what you've become, and he would be proud." "My father died," Marcus replied, his voice harder than he intended, "because we live in a country where a colored man can't get proper medical care. And I went to war supposedly to defend that country. To defend the system that killed my father. Tell me how that's supposed to make sense, Mama. Tell me how that's supposed to feel like pride." Eleanor didn't have an answer. But she opened her Bible, the same worn Bible that had belonged to Samuel, Marcus's father, and read to him from the Book of Lamentations, the book of mourning and lamentation. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. He has walled me in so I cannot escape, he has weighed me down with chains. Lamentations 3 verses 1-7. But listen, Eleanor continued, turning the page forward, listen to what comes next. Yet this I call to mind and therefore I have hope, because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. Marcus listened, but the words felt hollow. Where was God's compassion in the system that had killed his father? Where was his faithfulness in a nation that asked men to die for freedom it would never grant them? By 1948, 3 years after the war's end, Marcus had found work as a teacher, the only profession that seemed willing to hire a black man with his education and experience. He taught history at Fisk University, and in his classes, he told his students the truth about the war, about the sacrifice, about the rejection that followed. He also became involved, reluctantly at first, with the civil rights movement that was beginning to crystallize around figures like James Farmer and the newly formed Congress of Racial Equality. He didn't believe anymore that legislation would be enough, that laws could change hearts. But he participated anyway, because the alternative, silence, seemed like a betrayal of Bill Jackson and the thousands of other young men who had died believing the lie that sacrifice would be rewarded. In 1950, Marcus met Ruth Coleman, a young woman who was studying social work at Meharry Medical College. She was intelligent, committed to justice, and had a faith that hadn't been shattered by racism the way Marcus's had. They married in 1951, and over the years, Ruth would help Marcus understand something that had eluded him in his bitterness, that fighting for change wasn't about getting recognition from those in power. It was about building a better world for those who came after. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Marcus's father, was born in 1952. Holding that child, Marcus felt something shift. The boy represented possibility, the potential for a world different from the one Marcus had inherited. But only if people like Marcus were willing to continue fighting, even when the fight seemed hopeless. What do you think about the choice faced by veterans like Marcus, continue fighting for a nation that rejected them, or withdraw from the struggle? Comment below with your thoughts. How would you respond to that impossible paradox? We value your perspective and read every comment. Marcus Washington lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He saw the legal infrastructure of segregation begin to crumble, though the walls of discrimination, social, economic, psychological, proved far more resilient. He continued teaching at Fisk until his retirement in 1975, and spent his final years documenting the experiences of black soldiers, ensuring their stories wouldn't be lost to history. He died in 1989, at the age of 70, having seen more progress than he believed possible in those bitter years after the war, but not nearly enough to fulfill the promise that was supposedly being defended. At his funeral, attended by nearly 1,000 people, speakers included civil rights leaders, fellow veterans, students he had taught, and his own family. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when his son, Samuel, now a prominent attorney who had argued cases in front of the Supreme Court, stood and read from his father's unpublished memoir. My father faced a paradox, Samuel said, his voice clear and steady, that no soldier should ever have to face. He was asked to fight for a nation that refused to acknowledge his humanity. He was told that his sacrifice would prove his worth, when the very fact that he had to prove his worth revealed the nation's sickness. This was the burden placed on all black soldiers in World War II and every American war before and after, to fight for freedom they were denied, to die for a nation that wouldn't save them. Samuel paused, looking out at the crowd. But I want to tell you something about my father that you might not understand unless you really think about it. He continued to fight. He continued to teach. He continued to believe that the contradiction could be resolved, not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient, persistent demand that America live up to its stated ideals. He knew those ideals were hypocritical. But he also knew something else, that the hypocrisy could be used as a weapon against the hypocrites. If America claimed to defend freedom, then black soldiers defending their nation could demand that freedom be extended to them. If America claimed that all men were created equal, then the fact that some men had to fight to prove they were equal revealed America's failure to live up to its own standards. Samuel opened the Bible that Marcus had carried through the war, the same Bible that Eleanor had read from on that day when Marcus came home bitter and broken. "My father underlined this verse from John," Samuel said. John 15 verse 13, "Greater loveth no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." But underneath it, my father had written a note. And I want to read it to you. The question is not whether we will lay down our lives. We will. The question is whether the nation will recognize that love, will honor that sacrifice, will finally see the image of God in those who bleed for it. Until it does, the work is not finished. In the decades after Marcus's death, scholars and historians began to recover the stories of black soldiers that had been buried or minimized. The contributions of the 92nd Infantry Division, the 761st Tank Battalion, the Tuskegee Airmen, and countless other all-black units became recognized as central to the American military victory in World War II. But recognition came late, and for many of the men involved, it came too late to heal the wounds of betrayal. In 2002, the U.S. Army officially recognized that systematic racism had resulted in the denial of military decorations to black soldiers. An investigation found that 7 black soldiers from World War II were upgraded to the Medal of Honor, finally receiving the recognition that had been denied them for 50 years. It was a small gesture toward justice, but it was something. Marcus had always understood what that investigation would eventually prove, that the system itself, not individual merit or performance, determined whether a black soldier's sacrifice would be recognized. Thousands of acts of heroism went unremarked because the system couldn't tolerate the implication that black men were equal to white men. The paradox that defined Marcus's life, that he had to fight for freedom he was denied, had to prove his humanity through sacrifice because the nation refused to acknowledge it, became the defining paradox of the black American experience. It was the central tension of the civil rights era and continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about systemic racism and American identity. What emerges from this paradox is a portrait of extraordinary courage. Not the courage it takes to fight an external enemy, though that is certainly present. But the more profound courage required to continue believing in a nation even when that nation has fundamentally betrayed you. To continue fighting for justice within a system designed to deny it. To continue hoping when hope seems irrational. This was Marcus Washington's true legacy. Not the medals he earned in combat, though those were real. Not the laws that were eventually passed, though those were necessary. But the decision, made over and over again throughout his life, to continue the work of building a better nation, knowing that he would probably not live to see the full realization of his dreams. In his final interview, conducted in 1988 by a documentary filmmaker, Marcus was asked if he regretted joining the military, regretted fighting for a nation that had rejected him so completely. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I joined because I believed in something larger than myself," he said finally. "I believed that America, despite all its sins, was trying to become something better. I still believe that." The belief was tested, was nearly broken, but it wasn't destroyed. And I think that's the real victory, not winning the war against Germany, though that mattered. But keeping alive the belief that this nation can be better, that it can finally live up to its ideals, that it can see the image of God in all its people. That belief is what sustained me. And I pass it on to my children and grandchildren. When he died the following year, his obituary in the New York Times mentioned his military service and his role in the civil rights movement. But it was a photograph that seemed to capture something essential: Marcus in uniform at the end of World War II, decorated with medals, his face showing the strain of what he knew but the world didn't yet acknowledge, that he had saved a nation that wouldn't save him. That photograph became iconic in the historical recovery of black military service. It embodied the paradox: a man in uniform, representing sacrifice and service, bearing the physical marks of heroism, standing in a nation that refused to grant him basic human dignity. The image asked a question that America is still trying to answer: what does it mean to ask men to die for freedom they don't possess? What does it mean to accept that sacrifice while denying the freedoms it was supposedly meant to defend? The answer, for Marcus, and thousands of men like him, was that it meant carrying a weight that no soldier should ever have to carry. It meant fighting on two battlefields, one external, against Nazi Germany, and one internal, against the racism embedded in the nation's very soul. It meant being both hero and victim, savior and rejected. It meant finding the courage to continue the work of justice knowing that full justice might never come in your lifetime. But it also meant something else, that ordinary men, faced with impossible contradictions, could choose to transform that contradiction into fuel for change. Marcus's choice to teach, to speak, to ensure that the stories were told, to involve himself in the civil rights movement, these were acts of profound defiance against the system that had rejected him. They saved a nation that wouldn't save them. And in the saving, they transformed themselves and ultimately, though slowly and painfully, helped transform the nation as well. If this story of Marcus Washington and the paradox faced by black heroes has moved you, if you've been challenged to think about the contradiction between American ideals and American practice, subscribe to our channel now. Like this video and comment below with your reflections on the question, how should we honor those who sacrificed for a nation that refused to save them? Share this story with others. Tag someone who needs to hear about Marcus and the thousands of men like him whose sacrifice shaped America while America refused to acknowledge them. Together, let's ensure these stories are never forgotten. Thank you for bearing witness.